I'd like to welcome Michelle Punk. She earned her Master's of Arts in Interdisciplinary Studies degree in anthropology, has a PhD in physical geography, also both from OSU. She has over 20 years experience in cultural resource management. Janna Tuck earned her BA in history from Western Washington University, has an MA in historical archaeology from PSU, has worked over 10 years as an archaeologist in the US and around the world. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to you guys.
Thank you,
Paula,
David.
Paula, can you let them share their screens? Are they all set up? Okay.
Great. Thank you, Paula. Thank you all for inviting us here. I'm really excited to speak to you all. It's been in 2006, I think I did a presentation for OAS, and it was one of my first things that I did in the Portland area, and I just had such a great experience with the group, so I'm really happy to be back. As David introduced, we are going to be let's see here, I'm going to share my screen. And does that appear as my presentation?
Yep.
Okay, great, thank you. So we're going to be, Janna and I will be presenting today on the results of excavations that were conducted by Historical Research Associates, HRA, at a site in downtown Portland a couple of years ago. The site 35 MU 197 encompasses a whole parcel at the northeast corner of Northwest 4th and Burnside, and many of you may know this corner as a vacant lot that has some fencing around it and often has some people camping around it these days. And it's right next to the Chinatown arch there as you go into the Chinatown area. Before I begin talking about the archaeological work we did, it's important to acknowledge where we are in Portland and the history of the inhabitants of this area, because we'll mostly be focusing on the Asian and Euro-American communities that were living in this area. But of course, originally, the Native Americans were the ones who lived here. And although no Native American artifacts have been identified at the site, we must acknowledge that the original occupants of the site were the groups that lived in this area. Thousands of years of Native American occupation of the Portland Basin is well documented through oral histories, ethnographic accounts, and the archaeological record. European settlers began colonizing the area in the mid-1800s. The project location was part of the original plat of the city of Portland, as you can see here on the 1852 GLO map of the area, and was part of Couch's Edition, which was a 640-acre land claim by Captain John Couch. The early dwellings on the project parcel were built primarily by European settlers. As Chinese immigrants first arrived in Oregon in the early to mid-1800s, they initially settled in the southwest and northeast regions of the territory, but moved into the Portland area as economic opportunities expanded. Chinese immigrants initially settled in the southwest quadrant of Portland in what is called Old Chinatown, but began expanding north of West Burnside Street in around 1880. Although Old Chinatown continued to exist, New Chinatown, with a concentration along 3rd and 4th Avenues, which 4th Avenue is here. You can see this is 4th Avenue right here, and this is Burnside, and there's a really sweet Trans Am with a T-top right there. So that the Chinese communities tended to move into the areas along 3rd and 4th Avenues, north of Burnside during the early 20th century. As a result of the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, there was a labor void in the area, especially on the West Coast, and in the 1890s as replacement workers for the Chinese. In Portland, a Japantown, and I'm going to butcher this and I apologize, Nihonmachi was established with this influx of Japanese into the area. It included the area north of West Burnside Street, all the way up to Gleason, and between the Willamette River and the Northwest Broadway Street to the west. In 1989, a 10-block area of the city, including the area that includes the project parcel, was listed in the National Register of Historic Places as the Portland New Chinatown, Japantown Historic District, and that's where we're operating in. Just a note for this presentation, when I'm talking about the Chinese immigrants and Chinese Americans and Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans who lived in this area in the early times, I'll talk about the Chinese community or the Japanese community, or in grouping them, I may talk about the Asian community. That's just as for ease of communicating what I'm trying to say here without going into all those specifics. And the same will be said for the European community, which includes European settlers and Euro-Americans. So this is what the site looked like around 2008. The building that had been there was torn down, and shortly after, a looter was seen by one of a professional archaeologist who happened to be in the area. And so the police were called, the Oregon SHPO, State Historic Preservation Office, was called, and the looter was stopped. I don't think they were caught, but the looting was stopped, and the SHPO coordinated to have Paul Salamano and his team from Willamette Cultural Resource Associates do a damage assessment of the looting pit and what was actually disturbed by the looting activities. Here you can see the building that was here before in 2008 that was torn down, Cindy's Adult Bookstore. That building was built, and it's actually a conglomeration of a couple of different buildings that were built in 1912 and 1924. And so before 2008, the area had been covered up for many decades, for almost 100 years. And you can see that this is a photo was taken in 1988, right before the building was torn down, and then the looting began. Subsequently, the land development arm of the city of Portland, now known as Prosper Portland, purchased the land and prepared to develop it. But one step in preparing the land for development is to address any cultural resources that are present. And that includes the archaeological site that encompasses this whole block, or the whole, parcel, which is where Cindy's bookstore was. So that whole parcel was raised. And when Paul did his data recovery, he recorded the site as the whole parcel. So now the city of Portland has to consider those things when they go to develop the site. HRA was hired to conduct testing and evaluation of the site, which included excavation of 4 test units. You can see here kind of in progress. We're standing at the southeast corner of the parcel looking northwest towards 4th Street. And here you can see Burnside and 4th with the project parcel there shown and the 4 test units. You can also see the test unit that Mr. Salamano did as the yellow box, and then the white circle is the looter's pit. Our goal was to better understand the history of the parcel's development and the nature of the archaeological deposit that was still underneath the surface. We tried to target areas that were adjacent to or in back of some of the buildings that might give us an idea of what was happening through time, and some of the backyard privies or things like that are the areas that really preserve good stratigraphic evidence of what has happened through time in a parcel. We used a combination of methods to elucidate the history of the parcel, including looking at historical documents and conducting the archaeological test excavations and artifact analysis. We also gathered information which was crucial to the identification of some of the artifacts and to understanding their function and importance by inviting the local Chinese and Japanese communities and individuals to visit the site. There I am with Morgan Young, who is on our team, doing a little site overview tour, and here are some of the community members who came out to look at the artifacts that we recovered. We also held a viewing in our lab for people to come and take a look at things to help us understand better what was going on and what was being found. also, it's hard to communicate how important and meaningful it was to us to have these community members share their knowledge with us, both during the site and lab visits, as well as afterwards via emails, phone conversations, and even a visit to one of the community members' homes to look at his collection. And I just want to give a shout out to Joyce, who is a OAS member who helped us out so much throughout this process. So I will present a history of the parcel and each of the buildings that were at the parcel through time, and kind of talk about the stratigraphic profiles that we encountered in the test units and how those deposits related to the history of the parcel. And then Janna will be giving you a more specific introduction to some of the artifacts that were found. And in particular, she's going to be emphasizing the items that are potentially associated with the early Asian communities. One of the really interesting parts about this particular site is that we are located, the site is located, as I said in the introduction, right at the confluence of where Japantown was, where New Chinatown was, and where a lot of European community members were already living. And so we have all this overlap of these communities going on. And that's one of the interesting things that we were trying to understand when we were excavating here. Please keep in mind that we only had 4 one-by-one test units, so we only got so much information, but I think we got quite a bit of information from what we did do. You'll note that, the addresses of some of these dwellings changed through time when there was a renumbering of the different houses and the streets were renamed. So I've included the original names of the different locations and then their updated names today. So first we'll focus on 26 North 4th Street, which is this dwelling that is up here at the top. And here is a view from standing kind of near Burnside Street and looking towards the northeast. The unit is in the far northeast corner of the lot. And this dwelling first shows up on an 1870 Castleman's 1870 bird's eye view of the city of Portland map. You can see here's a blow up of it. And the green arrow here shows where that dwelling is located. We don't know the exact date of its construction, but it was there by 1870. An 1879 overview map, you can see there's a dwelling here still. There's also a dwelling on this corner, which is right at the corner of Burnside and 4th. And then there's a structure shown in between them at this time by 1979. Here in the 1889 Sanborn map of the location, you can see that it was a dwelling at this time. There was a small structure or something on the back, and that's what we targeted, hoping that it might be representing a privy and that we might be able to capture some information going back to this earliest time period of the use of the dwelling and then through time, which you can see as it goes through time. That's a little high. I'm wondering if I can get rid of this. I may not be able to, but what it says here is that it's a Chinese laundry. And so Hong Li was a businessman in the community, a prominent businessman who took over the property at least by 1901 when the Sanborn map was made, and turned it into a laundry. The Chinese laundry is shown there in 1908 and 1909, still operating. And in 1912, shortly after this map was created, the owner of the building at 26 North 4th Street, the Marshall brothers, sold the property to a local real estate investor who tore down this building and the adjacent building here and tore them down and built a large 2-story wood frame building over the entire, that entire northern portion of the parcel. So you can see that outlined in green here on the 1938 Sanborn map. So here's the test unit TU1 that we dug at the location. And what you can see here is that we had very complicated stratigraphy. The lowermost strata encountered in the excavation unit contained artifacts that were common to the late 1800s or very early 1900s, domestic items. No items of Asian manufacture were present in this lowest area, strata. And these deposits were also found below a layer of burned architectural debris. And that burned material you can see here is a very dark layer. We know from newspaper archives that in 1903 there was a fire at the laundry. And so it may be that that layer of burned material had a lot of artifacts in it, may have been associated with that 1903 burn episode. And also you can see in the profile here some lime. So there were a lot of artifacts as well as the burned material in here, and a lot of other disposed of items, faunal material, other things like that. We think that we did intercept a privy at this location. And the lime was really a good indicator of that. That was often used to help to keep down insects and keep down the smell. So if this was in 1903, and we know that the laundry was occupied by Lee by 1901, then we can surmise that the lowest deposits probably date to between when the building was first built, which was sometime before 1870, until around 1901 or sometime around that time when the Hong Lee laundry was first took over the building. And again, as I mentioned, Janna will talk about more about the artifacts that were recovered from this unit. So the stratum, or the strata that were above that lowest deposit, these materials actually contained Asian artifacts all throughout them, and a high number of them. So this deposit, we assume, dates to when the Chinese laundry was active between around 1901 to 1912, when the building was torn down by the developer, and then all of these deposits were capped. Above this, we had a mixture of modern and historic period artifacts that were likely associated with the 2008 demolition of the building, of Cindy's building, and also a mixture of some of the materials from the 1912 demolition. Next is the dwelling that was just south of that of the Chinese laundry. So right here at 24 North 4th Street. And this is an overview of the excavations that we did there. So right here is the excavation of that test unit, which is test unit 3. Here again is test unit 1 that I just discussed. This is test unit 2. And we are facing this way is southeast. So we're kind of standing on 4th Street. The building does not show up in the 1870 bird's eye view of the parcel, but it does show up here on the 1879 map that I discussed before. And you can see it here on the 1889 Sanborn map. Now in this case, we targeted the back of the structure rather than what we think was probably a privy that was associated here with this red circle is, because that red circle is exactly where the looter's pit was. So that whole area was very disturbed by the looter's pit, and we wanted to try to get some intact deposits. So we went towards the back of the building there, of the dwelling. Between 1894 and 1911, city directories, newspaper articles, advertisements, and Sanborn maps alternatively listed this particular building as a boarding house and as a residence. The first evidence of Japanese occupation of the subject parcel was found in a 1905 Oregonian advertisement. Mr. K. Horita, a resident of the building, described himself as a Japanese experienced laundryman who was seeking work. So as you can see here in the 1901 map, it's already shown as a lodging house. And by 1908, it's shown as a Japanese dwelling. A 1908 City of Portland report of inspection card listed the owner of the building as Y. Kosako, and Sanborn maps identify it as a Japanese dwelling. As I said, city directories and newspapers suggest that the building mainly functioned as a boarding house with primarily Japanese community members being lodgers there between 1905 and its demolition in 1912. And again, in 1912, it was torn down, as well as the building to the north of it, to form this building, this two-story wooden building that stood until 2008. The strata within the unit also supported what we saw in the historical record. So the lowermost strata encountered in the unit contained artifacts that were reproduced during the mid to late 1800s. Notably, no items of Asian manufacture were recovered in this lowermost strata, in these lowermost strata. Since we know that people from the Japanese community lived in the building by 1905, we suggest that this lowermost deposit dates to between the earliest possible age of the building after 1870. To above this, we had a number of artifacts that were consistent with use in a domestic or boarding house setting, and these included materials of Asian manufacture, likely associated with the occupation and ownership of the parcel by people in the Japanese community. Then above this, there was a whole lot of demolition debris and a bunch of repositioned historic period artifacts, all jangled up in a mess that we believe is associated with the 1912 demolition of the location, and then a little bit of fill-in in order to build on top of that. And then the uppermost strata contain common modern items and redeposited historic and architectural debris. So this uppermost set of strata, which is actually a pretty thick deposit, likely is associated with the 2008 teardown of the building that was there. So it attests to that there was a little bit of elevation difference between some of the buildings, and we don't know exactly what was going on. And again, we only tested 4 1-by-1 meter units, but it gives us an idea of what may have been going on, and there just may have been a lot of differences in topography, even in the underneath like the 1912 building. So now we can move on to the dwelling that was at the corner of 4th and Burnside. This was a larger building. Here you can see our excavation of it. It's TU4 here in the foreground. Right there in the background is the TU3 I was just talking about, and then up in the corner is TU2, that first unit that we talked about. I'm standing right at the corner of 4th and Burnside and taking this photo. So this dwelling is shown on this Castleman's 1870 bird's eye view. You can see there in the corner of B Street and North 4th. But the first documentation of the dwelling actually comes in Portland city directories in the 1860s. Between 1864 and 1867, there are a whole bunch of people that are listed at the address, including merchants, tinsmiths, a purser steamer. So different people who probably represented lodgers in this dwelling at that time. So there by 1864 at least, we know that it's still there in the 1879 map. You can see it on the 1889 Sanborn map there. We place the TU at the back of the dwelling again in this one. There is no evidence of a privy on any of these maps for this particular dwelling, but it is a larger dwelling, and it may have actually had a privy that was attached to the house. So we were trying to maybe catch that with this placement of TU4 here. By 1901, the dwelling is shown as a lodging house with a carpenter in the basement. And then according to the 1908 to 1909 Sanborn, the building on the corner is still there, which is kind of difficult to see, but basically it's this outline right here, but it's been hooked onto by a bunch of little stores, and there are storefronts all along here to another dwelling that was here before this time as well. So this whole portion of the parcel was turned into a business area. Some of the businesses that we know were there show up on a 1910 simplex map of the project area. And you can see that there was a saloon on the corner there, probably in the big dwelling, a nice large saloon. shooting gallery next to it. And you can also see that the Hong Lee Laundry is up here still, shown on the 1910 map. In 1924, all of those buildings were demolished. And this concrete structure was erected at the location that same year. So this occupies that entire portion, front side of the block. And then back here, and these two buildings would have represented the buildings that were built. Actually, this is, at least the shoe shop building would have been the building that was built in 1912. In 1930, the city of Portland expanded Burnside Street. So down here is Burnside on the southern portion of this map here. Here's 4th Street. And Burnside was expanded about 30 feet to the north, or sorry, 20 feet to the north, which made the rest of the parcel here, and that's the project parcel is outlined in red. And so you can see that the northern portion of the parcel then ended up being about 2/3 of our area, and about 1/3 was represented by this southern portion of the parcel, lot 2. It cut the storefronts right off, but they maintained their place there even into the 1930s, as you can see from this 1938 Sanborn map, where restaurants and storefronts are still present. So that test unit, which we placed there, ended up intercepting what looked like structural remains from some of the buildings. Here was a cement basin and pipe that we think was associated with the building that was there, built there, the cement building built there in 1924. Underneath that, what you can see is here's the basin and that pipe. There was another concrete floor right under the basin. And then underneath that, there were 2 brick features, one here and one here to the south. These brick features were actually separate. When we saw them, we did a little more excavation and you could see it. But this one to the left was actually a series of bricks that went down about 4 or 5 courses in what we could see in our excavations, while the brick floor to the right was only 1 course of brick thick. And then on top of that was a nice, thick, really intact deposit of just really rich artifacts mixed with some burned material that was just right sandwiched directly underneath that concrete slab and over top of the brick. Here you can see, looking down, that we dug through that layer of brick floor and saw that there was only one brick course deep. And here you can see that those 2 brick features there in profile. And the reason why we think that they're 2 different features, separate features, is because you can see here the brick foundation, or possibly stairs or a pier perhaps, that goes down a number of courses, while this is just 1 brick thick and does not actually go under this. So these may have been separate. We think they're associated with that earliest building that was there, the 1864 building, but we're not exactly sure whether that single course of brick capped the earliest deposits, or it may have been put there after the building was built, and it may date to after the thicker brick pier here. But what we got underneath that single course of brick were primarily sterile sediments. We did have 1 artifact, a piece of pressed glass that could be, early 1800s. So consistent with that, but we only had this very small area that we could get to because we were so deep within the unit. Above the brick is that thick artifact deposit. And although that artifact deposit, you might think dates to sometime between around 1864, when the building was built, and the time it was torn down in 1924, the artifact assemblage that we got from there actually argued that it was a little more constrained period of time, from around 1903 to 1909 when that was present. And the ending date on this time period makes sense when you consider that the area adjacent to the structure, adjacent to this particular dwelling, had all those stores built in 1908, 1909. And so this whole area would have been capped at that point. So probably this deposit was capped at that 1909 time period when it was converted into stores. Above this, we had a bunch of demolition debris and sandy fill sediment that likely represented the fill that they put on when they tore down the building in 1924 and then built the concrete building over the top of it. Of note, none of the literature or map sources that we looked into for this particular dwelling indicated that people from the Asian community lived here. Even the lodgers, we couldn't find any evidence of any of the lodgers. They were all from kind of European named people. And there was only one artifact of Asian manufacture that was recovered in this entire excavation as well. At the top of the excavation unit, there were a bunch of modern things mixed with historic period artifacts, so likely associated with the 2008 demolition of the building that had stood there since 1924. And then the final building is in the southeast corner of the parcel there along Burnside or B Street. You can see that it's a dwelling. We excavated this test unit right here, TU2 at that location. You can see TU4 that we just spoke about was right here. TU3 is in this area and TU1 is over to the right. So in 1889, you can see it's a dwelling. This particular building does not show up on either of the bird's eye maps that we had. So it was built sometime between 1879 and 1889 when we can see it on the Sanborn maps. By 1901, it shows a small outbuilding on the back. Let's go back. And so this is where we targeted deposits during our excavations and put TU2 right here at the back, hoping that maybe we would intercept a privy. Now, the Portland City Directories list the property as a boarding house beginning in 1892 until at least 1916. So even though it's listed as a dwelling here at this time, we know that it was used as a boarding house. And then again, around the 1908, 1909 time period, the entire first floor was made into a storefront, and then there were stores built in between the two buildings. The city directories and newspapers indicate that various tenants occupied this particular dwelling that was converted into a stores in the upstairs, including people with quote unquote immoral purposes, prostitutes. We also know based on city directories that the stores that were built adjacent to this particular dwelling that was there on the corner also had lodgers in them, including Mr. and Mrs. Takabayashi, who resided in the location in 1907. So we know that people in the Asian community were also residing in this portion of the property. The simplex map shows that we had a restaurant and a barbershop that were there at the location. And in fact, that barbershop was run by a guy named Peter Callis from 1909 until the building was demolished in 1904. And then, of course, Burnside was trimmed back, or expanded, sorry, so the storefronts were trimmed back, and you can see all the stores there, and as the parcel looked in 1938. Stratigraphically, this unit was a disappointment. We found a little bit of modern material in the upper 30 centimeters of the unit, but otherwise the majority of the sediments in TU2 were a homogeneous mixture of historic period artifacts and demolition debris. And all of these materials appear to date between the construction of the dwelling at the location between around 1879 and its demolition in 1924. We did run into some intact materials down below, but they were culturally pretty much sterile. So unfortunately, we hit maybe a basement, I don't know, or something that was dug out during the 1924 demolition of the site that created this just mixture of materials. And however, although the unit was stratigraphically a dud, it was archaeologically rich. It contained the majority of the artifacts that we recovered from the site, and the collection was very diverse, with artifacts from both the Asian and European communities represented. Additionally, even though the assemblage was highly mixed, it included materials that likely originated from the people who lived and worked at the location. And Janna will get more into this in her talk which is my segue into Janna. Your turn.
Hello, everyone. Okay, I'm going to let Michelle stop sharing and then I'll share. If I can, let's see. What are you guys seeing? Anything?
Nothing yet. There you go.
There we go.
Is it there?
Yep, but we need to put it towards into the slideshow.
I know, I can't.
The bottom. Yep,
Here.
there you go. That's it.
Ah, do you see the right screen? This big one?
Nope. I think you're gonna have to stop sharing and re-pick your screen.
Okay. How's that?
That's it.
Woo! Got it. That's the tough part is over, right? Okay, hello everyone. Glad to be here. I haven't done one of these in a really long time, so I've been very nervous, as Michelle will attest to. But here I am, gonna make it work. Yes, I was a part of this wonderful project, and we had a plethora of wonderful artifacts come from this site. There were about 3,000 that we got to analyze specifically in our HRA laboratories, and 221 of those artifacts were of Asian manufacture. They were primarily exported ceramics from China and Japan, also some opium smoking accessories and gaming materials, which I'll get into later. This was a real learning experience personally for me. I have always concentrated on historic period materials in my education and work, but this was the first time I've been able to work with artifacts of Asian manufacture and learn about early Asian and Asian American communities in Oregon, so wonderful. So this presentation is a journey of the education that I received as much as it is a window into the early everyday lives of Asian immigrants and Asian Americans. I will be talking about form and functions of these particular artifacts, but I do want to emphasize that form, function, or origin of these items does not and should not equate to the identity of the individual that may have used these items. In our discussions with the local Asian and Asian American community groups, this was a point that was brought up again and again, and rightly so. A couple of examples that they gave were that Chinese stoneware items in particular were used cross-culturally between Japanese communities and Chinese communities. Chinese families often like to use Japanese wares for ceremonial purposes, things like that. So we also know that early Asian and Asian American communities commonly used European goods, of course, and vice versa, despite the overt legislation that we tried to put through early on in the formation of this country, such as the Chinese Exclusionary Act in 1882. Euro-Americans and non-Asians utilized Asian imports often on a grand scale. So all that to say, the objects do not the person make. Okay, so onward and upward. We're talking about first generation immigrants here, and so a little bit of historical context. People from China and Japan and other Asian countries were living and working in Oregon beginning in the mid-1800s. First generation families in Japan are discussed as Issei, which corresponds to the Meiji and Taisho eras. The Meiji era in Japan was between 1868 and 1912. The Taisho era was between 1912 and 1926, and these are names of the current reigning emperor of those times. In China, first generation families are discussed as Xinca, which correspond to the Tungche and Qing dynasties. Chungshe was between 1868 and 1912, and Qing Dynasty was between 1875 and 1908. I am going to bore you with a little bit of a ceramics lesson, just because so much of our artifacts, pertinent material that I'll be discussing is related to ceramics of Asian manufacturers. So, and there are two really specific kinds of porcelain that was exported out of both China and Japan. You know, in classic archaeological classification systems, we talk about these as import and export porcelains, which is not confusing at all to anybody. Super simple, of course. But I will be going through it, so don't be scared. Overseas import porcelains are from either China or Japan, are traditional, common, everyday porcelain tableware that are used by Asian and Asian American communities in the past, and to this day, some of these forms are still as they were 100 or 200 years ago. In China, these are now known as the mingyao, or folkware, which is a term presented to the current archaeological community that I know of by Philip Choi, who is a very esteemed academic and scholar. In Japan, there was a traditional ware called imadi in the 17th and 18th centuries. Japan focused a lot of its energy on export ware and not necessarily on their own domestic ware. So it wasn't until a movement called the Mingei movement, or folk craft movement, in the early 20th century, where there was like a really concentrated return on the production of domestic ware in Japan. Yes. Overseas import porcelain from both countries are porcelain forms of everyday tableware, such as rice bowls, serving bowls, sake bottles, teapots, spoons, etc. And a lot of them have, or most of them have, traditional motifs, hand-painted, often hand-painted patterns and glazes. These are some of the most common Chinese import porcelains that you will find in North American archaeological sites. Of course, there are more, but these are just the most common that we run into in this part of the world. We've got bamboo right here. Bamboo tends to be a grayer paste porcelain, with hand-painted motifs of bamboo, stones, and flowers. It's often referred to as three friends in older archaeological reports. I am not clear why. I think it's probably just a misinterpretation of symbology. Double happiness is right here. You can see the Chinese characters here for happiness. And then these swirls are symbols of vines. Double happiness is also a grayer paste porcelain. And it too has an erroneous name in a lot of older reports. I think they call it swirls quite often, which is not really correct. These other two, I should say bamboo and double happiness both are not exported outside of China after 1900. So they're both like a wonderful temporal indicator when you find fragments of these in archaeological sites. Four Season Flowers is a hand-painted pattern, floral pattern. It's got each floral design represents a different season on these wares. And then wintergreen is just distinctive because of its luminous jade green slip glaze, which is gorgeous. The wintergreen, again, is often misidentified as celadon. Celadon is actually a lovely, beautiful glaze in its own right from a very particular part of China. And if you're a fan of Depression era glass like I am, it sort of looks like jadeite. It's monochrome, almost kind of milky, But it is not wintergreen. They are not the same thing. So there we go. These are examples of Japanese overseas importware. You can see there's various types of rice bowls here. This is a teapot, a particular style teapot. They would have had a lovely bamboo handle attaching here. Japanese import porcelains had an array of different kinds of motifs that usually representing flora, fauna, sometimes religious motifs, and things like that. They also employed different manufacturing techniques. We've got a couple kinds of stencilware here. This is hand painted, and these are transfer print. And this is a Japanese version of wintergreen, which I have been told tends to be a little glossier and maybe a little brighter than the Chinese wintergreen, although I've never seen one myself. So, of course, there are other types of ceramics that are exported out of both China and Japan, stoneware being one of them. Stoneware, according to Euro-American and European classification systems, tends to be described as non-porous and highly vitrified. Japan has a wonderful array of stoneware, so it's much more diverse and broader in terms of its definition. There's a toki porous stoneware, which is represented by these bowls here, which tends to be, I think, between an earthenware and a stoneware. There's a seki, which is a vitrified stoneware, and it tends to be unglazed, like around the rim of this teapot lid. And also a hanjiki, which is half porcelain, described somewhat like between stoneware and porcelainware. Chinese brown glazed stoneware. It's also referred to as black glazeware in China. Is utilitarian ware from China. It is used for a variety of purposes and then reused and reused again. So, I'm going to describe what these jars tend to be used for, but they are often used for various purposes. And it's interesting to note that in China, you could go to certain provinces in China today, and you could find manufacturing places that were still making these same pots as they did 500 years ago. We've got spouted jars, and these tend to be used for soy sauce, vinegars, and oils. Shoulder jars, which are sometimes just called wide mouth jars, tend to be used for fermented soybeans and sauces. Globular jars were meant for shipping soy sauces, wine, and vinegar. And barrel jars, which are often are just a large version of like a straight barrel jar. They were also used for shipping food and in some cases gunpowder, from what I've read. And then we have liquor jars, and they are really distinctive because of this bulbous base, and they tend to have highly glossed glazes like black, green, really exciting glazes. They probably, they know they contain distilled spirits, and they were probably manufactured by the largest manufacturer of these kinds of things from 1875 on, called Wing Lai Company. These are often described or discussed as tiger whiskey jars, which I just think kind of should be put to bed because it really didn't have anything to do with whiskey in particular. There's a variety of distilled spirits that they contained, and it definitely didn't have anything to do with tigers. So we're moving on to overseas export porcelain. Like I said, there is a big difference between the two. The biggest difference being that export porcelain was marketed towards European and Euro-American tastes and economies. So they were really driven by European markets, essentially. There are many different patterns, many different motifs. These theme, basically the design of the plate is based on one theme, and then there's many variations of that one theme. So like the geisha girl plates, for example, have over 200 different geisha girl landscapes or geisha girl themes. And these are just 4 really basic ones, but there's so many, it's impossible to describe them all. I should say also that these titles of the themes were likely given by European producers or markets, so they aren't necessarily culturally accurate. The Canton or Nanking ware, and yes, for your ceramic people out there, I know there is a difference between the two, but for simplicity's sake, they both do represent a landscape with a pagoda or a temple and a willow tree. And if it looks similar to the willow transfer print that became very popular out of England, it's because maybe they copied that, you know, as Europeans tend to do. So we also have altar of love or Valentine. We've got some flaming hearts and a pair of doves. That was a common motif in that pattern. The geisha girl landscapes were exactly that, or Japanese landscapes with women in kimono. And Rose Medallion was a paneled flora and fauna extravaganza, as you can see. I do want to talk quickly about just the material culture of opium and opium accessories. We did find a few fragments of pipe bowls, and it is interesting to think about all the different items that one might encounter that could possibly be associated with the smoking of opium at sites like this. This sketch is based on a list made in 1882 from what was called a smoker's kit, and it included a small little container for your opium that could be shell or ceramic or metal or bone, a sponge to cool your pipe off. This was the lamp that you would use to cook your opium, and it included a glass cylinder of various types with some oil. This was a needle, maybe it could be a spoon where you would you would use to cook the opium with. These were cleaning and trimming utensils. Of course, we've got the pipe here. Pipes could be made of a variety of material, including bone or ivory, metal, bamboo. And then here's the bowl right here. Here's a close-up of the bowl. Again, there's many varieties of opium bowls. They usually ceramic, stoneware, or earthenware. Here's a nice little diagram of how these things go together. And then this is a lamp, or you know, a close-up of a cooking glass lamp. Again, many different varieties and styles, some very basic, some very decorative. And the last item that we came across in our site were gaming accessories. This is a nice image from the excavations of the Chinese Quarter in Jacksonville, Oregon by Chelsea Rose and colleagues in 2006. We have these glass beads. They were very popular in the game of Go, which is a form of Chinese chess. They were made of white glass or black glass. They were called Go pieces or Shaozi pieces, which I am told means bead. There's also Chinese Wen coins that were used for gambling or gaming, bone discs, metal disc, dice made of bone. There's formal items that people used for gaming, but there's also a lot of informal items such as, you know, refabricated metal pieces and buttons and whatever was around. As Michelle said, there was an emergency data recovery at the site prior to us being there in 2009, and so this kind of gave us a picture of what to expect. There was bamboo fragments, which is exciting from a historical perspective, just because of it's a bit earlier, pre-1900. Transfer transfer print ceramic. There was also reported to be a lot of Chinese brown glaze stoneware fragments and other stoneware fragments, such as this lovely, lovely little guy over here. So entering into the excavation, I'm going to start with TU1, which is the one associated with the Hongli laundry. And the most intact deposit was from 1901 to 1912. I made my own little unit marker here. This is the Hongli laundry, as Michelle had noted, and this is generally where TU1 might have been, maybe not exact. We did find a lot of laundry items. We found porcelain buttons, shell buttons. We found porcelain collar studs and lots of safety pins and straight pins. And the excavators at that unit noted blue dye in the excavation unit when they're excavating it, which is bluing, an early form of bleach that might have been used, part of the laundry. And we also found a lot of import porcelain, mostly Chinese, in this unit, which is not a surprise, really. These are a few of the items. We've got some bamboo, which is fantastic. Some teacups. This is a wintergreen teacup, of course. I've highlighted this mark at the base. I'm going to talk about rain marks in the next slide. This may or may not be a mark of when it was made. It might have just been, you know, the author of this form, the potter himself, giving himself an abstract name, but it wasn't decipherable, and it didn't really give me any clues as to when it was made in particular. We also found some Four Seasons flowers. This is a large serving bowl, fragments of a rice bowl, spoon, just lovely material. This is a rain mark, as I was talking about earlier. There's an archaic script rain mark. Technically, the first two characters should name the dynasty it was made in. The second two characters should name the emperor it was reigning during its production. And then the last two should be the year it was made. This is a classic rain mark from the Tungchi dynasty from 1862 to 1875, and I think they look similar, but as Philip Choi points out in one of his articles, these were often printed into abstraction, meaning the print became abstract. So the actual information doesn't really register or isn't really readable, and also these rain marks were used well past the actual point of the production. So they're not a great temporal indicator, as it turns out, but they sure are fun to look at and try to decipher. Okay, so we've got a lot of Chinese brown glaze stoneware in this unit as well. There was Chinese brown glaze stoneware everywhere except for TU4, but this one had the most, and so I'm just going to present it here. This was probably a liquor jar here, and then we had tons of fragments of lids from various types of vessels. It's concave lids, convex lids, and flat lids. And this is just a lovely reminder from Mr. Choi that Chinese containers weren't used specifically for anything. They were used for everything and anything. And there's no gospel involved, which I love. And just a few more interesting items. We did end up finding a game piece, a Go chess game piece, which was really fun. We found an 1883 American penny, which is always great for an archaeologist. And then we found several gastroliths, more gastroliths in this unit than any other unit. If you're not familiar with what those are, they were bits of ceramic that were essentially fed to domestic fowl, chicken, and turkey in order to aid in their digestion. So that's why they look a little bit rough around the edges. But they are a great indicator of urban farming, which obviously took place in this area. Just gonna drink some water. Okay, so TU2, we're down here. This is close to where the looting pit had been, which would have been right here. And this is the one we had high hopes for, as Michelle said. We were super excited because there's Japanese occupants over here and Chinese occupants over here, and then there's all these commercial buildings here. There's my silly circle. Oh, I should mention, you know, like Michelle said, there's saloons, shooting galleries, a barber, coffee house. There's lots of stuff going on down there. And we did find a few fragments of Japanese import porcelain in particular. These photographs above here are the fragments that we found. I've borrowed a couple photos from this wonderful comparative collection by Renee Campbell. I can tell you more about that if you like. But these are just images of what I, you know, the final form. Kind of nice to see what the final form would have looked like. We just got these little guys, but it was exciting just to find those. We also found some export porcelain from Japan, which was great. This is a beautiful teacup. All of these are in the Geisha Girl, within the Geisha Girl pattern from export porcelain. This was just one of these opportunities wonderful opportunities that we had with community members that helped us translate this inscription. It says Bond Company, and our translator researched it and found it was from Yokohama, Japan, and he's the one who pointed me in the direction of the Geisha Girl pattern, because he was like, they made a whole lot of these kinds of things. They made a whole lot of Geisha Girl pattern tablewares. So that was just a real pleasure to have that input. And we did find some opium bowl fragments, and this is probably the most complete fragment that we found. We found 7, I think, in total in the site, but yeah, this is the best, most complete fragment. I compared this to a typology that was created in 1987 based on an excavation of a Chinatown in California by Wiley and Higgins, and this would have been an inexpensive kind of opium bowl. It was made of earthenware, probably wheel thrown. It had someone's thumbprint right in the interior, which is super exciting. Glazed with red slip glaze, and it had these Chinese characters inscripted on the side that said "horse and heart," which was also translated by the community members that we were working with. The interesting thing about opium bowls is that at least the inscriptions can be deeply personal, so they are often someone's name or symbols of an experience that someone might have had, and so I think that this is probably something along those lines, someone's deep experience. We found other things as well, some Euro-American goods that relate to the, commerce and commercial aspect of this parcel. Of course, there was 2 saloons. So we've got a saloon token that dates from 1848 to 1874. A saloon token is something you could take into a saloon and cash it in for whatever the saloon token said it was good for. We also have a cuspidor, which is not a spittoon. Cuspidor is larger, heavier. This one was made of iron and had a, what's the word? Enameled interior. And barbers and saloons liked to have these in their interior spaces for their guests. So another item that may have had something to do with those ladies of the night as tenants in the area, we found about 6 rubber feminine syringes. which is a nice way of saying douche elements. But you know, business is business. Okay, so test unit 3. Here we are. We are at the back end of this dwelling that was occupied by Japanese residents for some time. Here we go here, my badly marked map. We were eager to find artifacts of Japanese manufacture here. And we did find a few. We found some Japanese import porcelain. This was fun. It's this is probably the handle or the spout from a kisu style teapot, which are, I think, small and quite personal sized teapots from Japan. Also a fragment of hanjiki, half porcelain sake bottle ceramic. There was also another opium bowl fragment located here, again from the Wiley-Higgins typology. This would have been an inexpensive bowl. It wasn't glazed. It had some small incised lines. It did have a thumbprint on the interior, so probably with wheel thrown. It's good to find that. We also found an 1899 penny, American penny, that had been punched through. It kind of a mystery. It could be a coin used for gaming. Chinese Wen coins were often strung together in strings. So it could have been repurposed for that, for those means. I was also reading recently about opium pipes and refashioning the hole once the smoking hole got gunked up or old. They would maybe refashion something to make it more stable. So I thought maybe that could be for that. It could be for ceremonial use, but it's an interesting piece of material culture. And then we get to TU4, which again, it's right here in the middle of this commercial hub that we were really excited, you know, about. And then, as Michelle said, we had a surprise. So a lot of the work in that unit was just trying to get through that barrier. We did find one spectacular item, though. A lovely shaving mug belonging to Frank G. Bowles, gilded and everything, and very complete. We did look him up, and he was a North Pacific Railway clerk. He lived in Portland from 1903 to 1905, according to Pope directories. He lived at various hotels, including the Esmond Hotel, which was one of Portland's first. The super fun tidbit about this one is that someone named Phil decided he wanted the mug, maybe after Frank Bowles left town, and carved his name here, P-H-I-L, the bottom of the mug, which is somewhere around over here. So that's really fun to find, especially all the hard work that went into that unit. So that's just scratching the surface. It's like we barely got started. There's so much more to come. We have so many more questions. Like Michelle alluded to earlier in the presentation there, we discovered that a lot of the artifacts did indeed tie back to the inhabitants of that parcel. And now we want to know more. We want to know more about how those diverse communities interacted. We want to know if there's more archaeological evidence of shared communal space among this diversity. There's just more questions to be had. So we're hoping that in the future that we can tackle that, or whoever does the work there will tackle that. And that's really it. I just want to say thank you on behalf of Michelle and I to the community organizations that helped us gather this information and the community members that made it possible.
Well, thank you very much. That was great. It's always nice learning about some place that is, I guess, so familiar or so close that totally ignorant about. So that was fantastic because I go by there all the time, all the time. let's see, what do we got in the chat? Let's see, we have a shout out to Joyce again, for kind of getting in contact with everyone and letting us observe that excavation as it happened as a society. And then also Kathy again would like to thank Jim, as well as to remind everyone to contact Glenda about Memories of George for next screenings newsletter. And at this time, does anyone have any questions? You can put them in the chat, or you can just open up your microphone and go ahead and ask. Questions?
Do you expect to do any further work with this site, or is everything wrapped up now, Michelle?
Sorry, I think my internet is breaking up a little bit. I'll try and answer this. As far as are there more excavations? Well, probably, and I don't know who's going to end up doing them. Can you all hear me okay, or am I breaking up? You can hear me okay, great. The city of Portland, Prosper Portland, is still planning on developing the parcel. And so we've been working with them to get a treatment plan in place so that additional archaeological investigations will be done at the site. The hope is that prior to any more excavations occurring, they'll do ground penetrating radar across the whole site and figure out where do we have these big voids like what we found at TU2, so that we can avoid those, because those don't have intact stratigraphic materials, even though they did have materials that related to the buildings and the people who lived there. We would like to try and target things that were more intact. And so by being able to kind of reconstruct what's under the ground using ground penetrating radar, then we may be able to target things more, a little bit better. Also, we'll have better ideas of where the actual impacts are going to be by the development. And then once they decide to develop, a request for proposals will go out to local companies, and someone will get to do this work. And, you know, of course, HRA would love to do it, and there are other companies that would be equally wonderful in doing the work. So I know that when that RFP comes out, there'll be a lot of people looking to do the work. As far as presenting the findings to the Asian community that visited the site, what we did do was we invited the different communities to come in and take a look at all of the artifacts that were gathered. We have not done presentations yet. There was, you know, this COVID thing happened, and everything kind of got shut down. So we would like to reach out and make sure that we're providing this information. We did provide the reports to all the different communities and said that if anybody wanted to copy a digital copy, we would, you know, make them a CD or a thumb drive, because we want to make sure that we're reaching anybody that can, or we would print out a print copy to them. And what I'm hoping is that when the next phase of work happens, that there will be even more interaction with the Asian community on what types of work will be done, and if we can get people involved in that. And as far, sorry, go ahead.
No, I had a different question. Go ahead and finish.
Well, there was the final one in the chat, which was where were the burials back then of Portland Asians. I don't know the question or the answer to that, but if Chelsea Rose is still on, she might know the answer to that. But I won't put her on the spot in case she's still not here.
Okay, well, my question, does anybody know anything about the guy who was originally digging the pit that started this whole thing off? I can't think of anybody besides archaeologists that would think that digging a hole in the site of a former adult bookstore would be fun.
Dennis Griffin, if you are able to unmute, I know that Dennis had a big hand in making sure that the site was protected when it was found.
Yeah, Michelle, if you can hear me,
Yes.
the police did find the individual, but by the time they got to his house, he was able to whisk off several boxes of artifacts. And the best I know is they've never recovered any of those. And there's been no conviction at all of him at all. So they were all lost, all that material. And it was a popular site. He wasn't alone. There were other people who had dug in that same area. He used the Sanborn maps to locate, much like Michelle did, to find out where the privy was, and he excavated. And that's a popular thing to do in Portland. When I was with the SHPO, we found a number of sites where people were looting, and we called the state police to stop them. So, bottle collecting mostly, whether it's by the train station or otherwise. Yeah.
And Chelsea did comment in the chat box. Thank you, Chelsea. I've forgotten about this. Lone Fir Cemetery has several burials, and yeah, that's a well-known site for Asian community members to have been buried. There have been some archaeological investigations I know that were done there in cooperation with the cemetery, and AIW did some work there. So I know that's one of the locations. Thank you, Chelsea.
Do we have any more questions out there tonight? All right, well, if not, I'd like to thank you both again. That was fantastic. So until next time, everyone, next month, first Tuesday, as always. All right, take care, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.